Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to support my colleague and friend, Senator Cortez Masto, in her efforts to bring this legislation not only to the floor, but to passage. This has been a long, long trail of broken promises and false assertions. It began with the broken promises and false assertions of judicial nominees who came before the Judiciary Committee to assure us that the protections of Roe versus Wade were precedent and that they would respect precedent. Of course, that all evaporated. We then heard the argument that this was states' rights. My friend from Utah may not like the phrase, but it's one that his side has used over and over and over again. Call it states' rights or call it federalism. The notion was that all we were doing was opening this up to states. But you heard right here on the Senate floor the notion that every pregnancy is subject to the control of the government from the moment of conception. That does not allow for a differentiation between one state and another. And now that the states' rights assertion has been proven false, now that it's clear that there are many members, not only of Congress, but of state legislatures who want a nationwide ban on women's ability to make these reproductive choices, it becomes clearer and clearer why this particular bill is so important. It is only a matter of time until we see those bills being voted on in legislatures trying to criminalize a citizen of one state if they go to another state to get this kind of care, or trying to create a nationwide abortion ban. However you call it, it will intrude on the ability of women to go and seek this care. And what we are seeing already is women with troubled pregnancies for whom there is an indicated treatment, unable to get the treatment that medical science knows is the right treatment, whether it's twins, one of whom isn't viable, or a woman's ability to have further pregnancies if this one is not terminated, or the ability of a woman to simply be treated for a sepsis, for instance, before it turns to life-threatening and not have to wait and look at the watch and let her get sicker and sicker, knowing that the end is the same in any event, but putting her life and health at risk in order to allow the will of a bunch of state legislators to turn up in the examination room or the treatment room with her and her family and her doctor. For all of these reasons, because the proponents of a nationwide abortion ban, because the proponents of undoing Roe versus Wade have simply been incredible for too long. We simply have to assume the worst, and this bill is an important and sensible way to make sure that if the presiding officer's state or my state want to allow that freedom to women, that women can come there and get the care that they need. Very often, in a troubled pregnancy, for their own or their future children's or the siblings' well-being. So for all those reasons, I wish we'd had the chance to vote on this and look forward to future chances. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, as we know, this Saturday marks the one-year anniversary of the day the United States Supreme Court decided to overturn half a century of precedent on a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. I appreciate the remarks of my colleague from Rhode Island and all of my colleagues that are here today. When they made this decision, it went against the 70 to 80% of Americans who believe that this decision should be made by a woman and her family and her doctor and not by politicians. As a result, as we predicted that day, women across the country are at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws governing their ability to access reproductive care. In states like Texas, women have been forced to carry pregnancies for days after learning that their baby would not survive because their doctors can't legally provide care unless their life is at risk. And then there was the heartbreaking story about the 10-year-old girl in Ohio who had to go to Indiana to get an abortion after she was raped. 10 years old. People said it was some kind of a hoax. It wasn't. It was real, and everyone in this chamber knows it. The Supreme Court's decision threatened women's health and freedom, and to this day, it demands a legislative response. Not a response where the women of Texas are told that they have different rights, in fact, no rights, compared to women in Minnesota, or even in our next door state of Wisconsin. Part of that is codifying Roe v. Wade into law. That is true. We must also address the full scope that women are facing, the full scope of threats right now. Recent reports have illustrated how social media companies are collecting and data brokers are selling location data that could be used to identify women seeking reproductive health care services. We know that the collection of this data, we know this, people on both sides of the aisle understand that this has ramifications beyond women seeking abortion care. They could have anyone, man or woman, seeking a mental health provider, an addiction clinic, counseling, therapy, all of it. The rules are murky, and the data is being collected and sold. That's why I'm leading the Uphold Privacy Act with a number of our colleagues, including Senator Warren and Senator Hirono. And that's why I am seeking unanimous consent to pass this legislation. Our bill sets common sense limits on how companies can use people's personal data. First, it bans data brokers from selling location data. Women making their most personal health care decisions should be able to go to their doctor's appointments and consult specialists without worrying that the data about their location, where they are going to be or are, will be purchased or sold. Second, it says you can't use health data for commercial advertising purposes, period. That means companies can't use data from fitness trackers or browser histories to sell ads, all healthcare data. And third, it gives consumers more say over how their personal healthcare information is used by allowing them to request that their data be deleted. It also places limits on what health data companies can collect about Americans. Consumers deserve to be in the driver's seat when it comes to determining how their personal health data is used. This legislation does just that. It's past time that we update our privacy laws in general, and I hope we get that done by the end of this year. But we must also update our health privacy laws to reflect the reality of how social media platforms and data brokers are profiting off our data. In a world without Roe, this couldn't be more urgent. I supported, with a Republican, limits on this health data to begin with. And now, as we are in this post-Roe world, as I note, it becomes even more important. I invite my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in declaring that these big tech companies cannot sell off, through data brokers, our private personal health care, and that our decisions should never be a tool for profit. This is not a radical proposal. It is completely common sense. As we get closer to marking a year without Roe v. Wade, I continue to stand with my colleagues in the fight for reproductive freedom. We stand firmly on the side of the American people who have come together time and time again in Kentucky, in Michigan, in Montana, in the middle of the prairie in Kansas, to defend reproductive rights. We will not settle for a reality in which our daughters have fewer rights than their mothers and their grandmothers. Madam President, I yield. And as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation be discharged from further consideration of S631 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Senator from Minnesota.
Just a few specific responses. First of all, this bill is very specific. It addresses health and location data. And as I noted before, I continue to believe that we need federal privacy legislation in general to address other privacy needs, but this bill is targeted at sensitive health data when it comes to location. And I note it was the conservative members of the Supreme Court that actually issued the broad decision to overturn half a century of precedent on a woman's right to make her own healthcare decisions, and that this bill is a targeted response on one issue, and that is to set common sense limits on how companies can use people's personal data. I just also wanted to respond to the issue of mifepristone, which was temporarily thrown out by one judge in the state of Texas, and that is now pending before several different courts. A different decision was made in another court in Washington State. But I will note that the statute referred to, which would somehow limit this drug that was approved by the FDA decades ago and has been found safe in dozens and dozens of countries across the globe, that law that was referred to was actually enacted, the Comstock Act, in 1873. 1873, when they treated pneumonia with bloodletting, when the Pony Express existed, and which I note is 10 years before they even did the Yellowstone prequel. So if my colleagues want to move backwards to that time period, those are the laws they are citing. I believe the people of this country want to move forward. I yield the floor.
You know, Madam President, listening to this debate today, I can't believe we're having these debates in 2023. It's just stunning to me that we're having to debate privacy and the ability to make your own reproductive health decisions and all the ramifications for it. But here we are. So I rise today to speak up for American women, the doctors who care for us, and our freedom to make our own healthcare decisions. What a novel idea that in the United States of America we would be able to make our own healthcare decisions. But thanks to a radically conservative Supreme Court and radicals in state legislatures, reproductive freedom is no longer a constitutional right in the United States. Roe v. Wade protected our freedoms for 50 years until it didn't. Nearly half of the 50 states have already banned abortion or are likely to do that. Half. And sadly, this change is already making American healthcare worse. It just breaks my heart to hear about the individual situations of women in Michigan. And fortunately, we're in a situation where the people of Michigan have stood up for reproductive freedom. But to see the women coming into Michigan, the people who are pregnant coming into Michigan, who are coming in to get help that they can't get in their own state, it just breaks my heart. A poll of OBGYNs released today by the Independent Health Policy Research Organization, KFF, shows the effects. 64% of OBGYNs surveyed said that the Dobbs decision has increased pregnancy-related deaths. Now think about that. 64% of the doctors, of the OBGYNs surveyed, said that this Supreme Court decision increased pregnancy-related deaths. 70% of OBGYNs said that the Dobbs' decision has made racial and ethnic inequalities in healthcare worse. And 68% of OBGYNs, the doctors serving women, say that the Dobbs decision has made it harder for them to manage their patients' pregnancy-related emergencies, including women who desperately want their babies. They're desperate for this. They want to have this child. And something comes up, and it breaks their heart and their family's heart, and there's an emergency that may threaten their life. And doctors are saying that it's harder for them to respond in an emergency. Just think about that. 68% of doctors say that this Supreme Court decision made it harder for them to keep patients alive. These doctors know what they need to do to save lives. In many states, they're just not allowed to do it. How could that be in America in 2023? And even doctors in states like Michigan, and I'm proud to say we now protect reproductive freedom in our Constitution, voted on by the people of our state overwhelmingly last November. But even we aren't immune from that. A state law in Texas allows vigilantes to sue doctors even in states where abortion is legal. So much for state rights. And radicals in other states are scrambling to pass similar legislation. That is why we need the Let Doctors Provide Reproductive Health Care Act. Thank you to Senators Murray and Padilla and Lujan and Rosen for leading this effort. I'm proud to be their partner, as we all are. This bill would ensure that healthcare providers in states where abortion is legal, states' rights, it's legal, can keep providing the reproductive health care their patients need. And it would help protect patients across the country who choose to access reproductive health care in a state where it is legal. I trust Michigan doctors. Michigan doctors know what their patients need. What Michigan doctors and their patients don't need are Texas legislators standing in their exam rooms. It's time to pass this legislation and protect doctors and to protect their patients. So, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-1297 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. Let me just say that 2 points to my colleague. First, fundamentally, this is about who makes medical decisions. Do we trust women? Do we trust the person that is pregnant? Do we trust their ability to work with their doctor? Who makes the decisions in the United States of America? And we stand with the women of America. The second thing I will say, because I get it's so difficult for me to hear over and over again about the sanctity of life when I lead the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, where we have to fight every day to make sure food is available for children who are born. And the House of Representatives just passed an agricultural appropriations bill that gutted WIC, which is the Women, Infant, and Children's Program for newborn babies and moms, to get them started in a healthy life. When we can't pass quality standards for Medicaid births, which are half the births of this country, because we have had objections on the other side of the aisle for years about somehow having quality standards for prenatal care and birth, is very hard for me to listen to the idea that we ought to be protecting. It's not just the unborn, it is the born. It's the children, it's the moms, it's the quality of life that we fight every day, food, healthcare, and so on. And so I find it very hard to listen to that language, and I'm very disappointed that there's an objection to a bill that would let doctors practice healthcare to protect women and babies. I yield the floor.
Madam President, leaves the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam President. Before she leaves the floor, let me just say to my seatmate on the Senate Finance Committee how much I appreciate her passion and leadership on this critical issue. And I note that the President of the Senate is also one of the outspoken members of our committee on this issue. And this has been a terrific debate coming from our side. And I particularly want to thank my colleagues for their comments. So it's been a year since the atrocious decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. I remember reading the leaked decision in the press early last May and realizing with dread that the court was going to strike down Roe versus Wade. And my first reaction was that the court had set in motion a catastrophe for the health, safety, and privacy of American women. To the horror of the 36 million women living in states that have already banned abortion or are likely to ban access to abortion, unfortunately, my prediction was right. Now, the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs tossed out a half a century of legal precedent, curtailed the fundamental rights of women, and jeopardized the health and safety of millions across the country. The court defied the American people, who are living with the grim reality that some of the nation's most powerful people are eager to violate their privacy and their basic right to make their own decisions with respect to health care. So the last year has been a nightmare for millions of women in America, and it's been especially felt by those living in the more than 20 states that have passed laws banning or severely restricting access to abortion. The personal stories that you hear if you spend time listening are gut-wrenching. Women in Texas who desperately wanted to be parents, who suffered pregnancy complications, nearly died trying to access life-saving care. Yet they were told, Madam President, they weren't sick enough to get it. Far-right politicians suing healthcare providers for providing care to a 10-year-old who had been raped, Madam President, and pregnant. The cruelty apparently is the point. I'm proud to be from Oregon, where abortion remains legal. We've got some of the most pro-choice laws in the country for those seeking reproductive care. That's because in Oregon, we understand people can make the best decisions for themselves and their families. But even in Oregon, we can't take freedom for granted. Extreme Republicans won't stop until they pass a national ban on abortion. And they're trying. A national 6-week ban was introduced in Congress right after the Dobbs decision came out. And anti-abortion advocates sought out a lone judge in Amarillo, Texas, to ban mifepristone, which is widely and safely used in medication abortions nationwide. The FDA approved this safe and effective medication for dispensation more than 20 years ago. And I organized the first congressional hearings about this drug as a member of the other body in 1990. And this effort was never based on some extreme or some political agenda. It was based on one proposition, that science ought to be making the judgments and not politics. So I came to the Senate floor in February, called on the administration to do everything it could to keep the life-saving medication on the market. And thankfully, the far-right extremists haven't won yet. But as a number of my colleagues have said today, and correctly, not home free as that case moves through the courts. Contrary to what Justice Kavanaugh told us in his concurrence in Dobbs, anti-abortion zealots are not leaving these matters up to the states. Several states are trying to restrict freedom of movement, criminalizing women who travel to other states for an abortion, or even the person who gives them a ride. Think about that. You can't sugarcoat that. They're talking about enacting laws that reach beyond state borders. And that harkens back to some very dark days in our history. This has always been about control. And one speaker after another on our side has said that through the course of the day. This is about politicians inserting themselves in exam rooms and into private decisions about whether and when to start a family. Now, I care about this issue for several reasons. And right at the heart of my concern is Americans' right to privacy. That right to privacy, Madam President, is what makes America America. And as women grapple with restrictive state laws that threaten their health and take away their privacy, they also face an equally pressing crisis of digital privacy and what we've come to call uterus surveillance. Governments are weaponizing the most personal and private data about women's bodies and health care and using it against them. And I and a number of colleagues on our side have been sounding this alarm for years that location data leached from phone apps is ripe for abuse. In states where extremists have restricted or banned abortion, that goes straight to a 5-alarm crisis. We also know that shady data brokers have tracked women to and from Planned Parenthood centers. They have and will sell this information to anybody with a credit card. And in states where abortion is illegal, anything women say or read online can be used against them. Researching birth control online, updating a period tracking app, even just carrying a phone into the doctor's office. You name it. It is potential evidence for the prosecution. The possibilities are frightening, and our laws governing women's sensitive private health data, as we think about what's ahead, we have to recognize those laws have been outdated and weak for decades. And I commend the administration for drawing attention to this issue and being interested in shoring up loopholes in our laws. More has got to be done. We've seen over the past year that Republican state attorney generals and governors are ready and willing to discard women's privacy in their quest to prohibit access to reproductive health care. So this has been a horrific year. And as my colleagues have said on the floor since this morning, we are going to be resolute. All the bills that the group led by Senator Murray and my colleague, President of the Senate, they're common sense. They're common sense, the bills, the package that my colleagues have offered today for unanimous consent. They go a long way towards protecting women and healthcare providers. And I just want my constituents to know, I want my colleagues here in the Senate to know I'm on the program. I don't think this is a time when we can even take for granted any of these concerns. Not a one. The whole question of access to care, right to privacy, making sure that states' rights really means states' rights and not tracking people down across the country. These are all priorities that my colleagues have laid out very, very well. And as long as I have the honor to represent Oregon in the United States Senate, I'm going to be working with all of them. And the fact is, as we close, and it seems like we're getting ready to wrap up, I think it's clear that the American people are on the side of my colleagues over here who've spoken today. I yield the floor.
Earlier this afternoon, my colleague Senator Markey asked unanimous consent to advance the Right to Contraception Act, and there was an objection heard. But I wanted to come to the floor to voice my strong support as a co-sponsor of the Right to Contraception Act. You know, across the country, women are frightened. They're frightened that after decades of progress in advancing their rights and freedoms, they are watching an activist Supreme Court ignore precedent and strip away their rights and freedoms. For nearly 6 decades, American women have come to rely on their right to control when and if they're going to have a family, including through the use of contraception. In fact, about 90% of women in the United States have used contraception. And in 1965, the Supreme Court correctly decided Griswold v. Connecticut, reaffirming that our Constitution guarantees the right to privacy. This particular case was over a Connecticut law that banned the use of contraception and imposed penalties, including up to 1 year in prison for doing so. So the Supreme Court correctly overruled the law as an invasion of the right to privacy and determined that Americans could use contraception, should they choose, without government interference. At the time, the majority opinion reasoned that there were many implied rights that Americans have within the Constitution. And on a basic level, this is obvious. Not every single right that we are due could be written into our Constitution. So this concept of implied rights is the foundation for various rights that Americans have come to rely on and frankly never think twice about, like the right to learn a foreign language or to travel across state lines or to live with your own family. Famously, 8 years after Griswold was decided, the Supreme Court used a similar legal foundation, the constitutional right to privacy, to rightly decide in Roe v. Wade that women in the United States have the right to abortion care. But despite Roe being the law of the land for nearly 50 years, and as, quote, settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court, entitled to respect under principles of stare decisis, end quote, according to Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, it was thrown out the window. And this Saturday will mark the 1-year anniversary since the activist Supreme Court, crafted, of course, by anti-choice Republican politicians, stripped 22 million women and counting of their freedom to control their bodies, families, and future. 1 year since women lost the right to an abortion nationwide, 1 year since women in my home state of Wisconsin were sent back to 1849, and I didn't misstate that, 1849, living under an archaic law that effectively criminalizes all abortion procedures. 1 year since women in America became second-class citizens. Sadly, that fateful decision that overturned Roe versus Wade put more of Americans' rights on the chopping block. In Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion, he explicitly said that the rationale used to overturn Roe should be used to overturn cases establishing the right to contraception, the right to same-sex consensual relations, and same-sex marriage. Justice Thomas wrote that the court, quote, should reconsider, end quote, all three of these decisions, saying the Supreme Court had a duty to correct the error in these decisions. He was essentially providing an open invitation to litigators across the country to bring their cases to the court, inevitably instilling fear among millions of Americans. Let that sink in. With the right to abortion care already ripped away from tens of millions of Americans, a Supreme Court justice essentially asked for someone to bring him a case so he can rip away the right of to one of the only tools many women have left to control if and when to have a family, that being access to contraception. Americans have spoken loudly and clearly that they do not believe that a woman's right to control her own body is an error, or the freedom for someone to love who they love is an error. We cannot rely on an activist Supreme Court to protect our rights and freedoms. Congress must act. So I stand here with the backing of 9 in 10 Americans who support access to all forms of birth control, to call for the Senate to listen to our constituents and pass the Right to Contraception Act. Our legislation is simple and common sense. It would guarantee the legal right for individuals to get and use contraception and stop politicians or the government from trying to get in the way. And that's it. Americans want the right and freedom to control their own reproductive health care without interference from judges or politicians. In my home state of Wisconsin, where women are already living under an 1849 criminal abortion ban, access to contraception is absolutely essential. Every person should have the right to control their own bodies, families, and futures, no matter where they live. And former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who advocated for the right to privacy, called it the right to be left alone. So I stand here to reiterate this sentiment and to tell Washington to pass our legislation and give women the right to be left alone. I yield back, Madam President.
1 year ago, Americans lost a constitutional right for the first time in history. And they didn't just lose it, Republicans ripped it away. Just 1 year now after the Dobbs decision, more than 22 million women have lost their right to an abortion. No corner of our country has been spared from the fallout. Abortion providers in states where abortion is legal, like in my home state of Washington, are being overworked and just totally overwhelmed with patients who've had to wait weeks and travel hundreds of miles to get an abortion. And then there's the wave of other appalling Republican attacks on abortion, proposals to charge grandmas and older sisters with human trafficking if they drive a minor out of state for an abortion, prosecute abortion providers, doctors, as criminals, ban emergency contraceptives like Plan B, and let's not forget the partisan lawsuit on mifepristone to rip safe medication abortion off the shelves in all 50 states. You know, when you listen to patients about what this all means, when you hear the actual stories, the nightmares that Republicans are putting women in this country through, they are heartbreaking. Parents driving miles and miles because their child was raped, their child's pregnant, and abortion is banned in their state. Doctors being forced to forego providing life-saving care because they feared Republican politicians will put them in jail for doing their job. Women facing miscarriages, left bleeding, unable to get the care they need for days on end. One woman learned that her fetus had no skull, no chance of survival, and she still could not get abortion care in her state. Another woman learned that she had an ectopic pregnancy, a serious life-threatening condition. She was not able to get an abortion. Instead, when she was on death's door, she ended up having to get a hysterectomy. Why? Because Republican politicians decided that their views mattered more than her health, mattered more than her family. Let's be clear. The vast, overwhelming majority of Americans stand with women and support the right to choose abortion. Every place abortion rights were on the ballot last November, every single place abortion rights won. Still, Republicans are ignoring their own constituents and doubling down on their extreme anti-abortion politics. Just now, when we tried to pass other basic protections, and I mean the most simple, most straightforward protections imaginable, protections that just say, yes, you can travel to another state for an abortion. Yes, doctors can provide an abortion in states where it is legal without fear of being thrown into prison. Yes, we will protect the right to birth control. Yes, we will keep your online health and location data private so it cannot be used against you. Republicans said, no, we're not going to let you do that. One senator on the floor earlier even said that legislation that restricts a woman's rights to travel is really about protecting minors from trafficking. Seriously, that is outrageous. And I was absolutely, and I mean absolutely outraged to hear him say that. I hope that the American people understand what those laws mean. What it means is that a grandmother taking her 17-year-old granddaughter who was raped, or maybe just wants to make her own personal health care decision, to a state where abortion is legal, could be jailed. States like Idaho have passed these laws that restrict travel. And what they do is hold young women captive in their own state and threaten anyone who might help them get the care they need with time in prison. Those kinds of laws and proposals in other states are an appalling attack on the rights of women and our most basic right as Americans to travel freely within our own country. I absolutely refuse to let a senator or anyone twist the reality of these truly heinous laws being passed to hold women captive and force them to stay pregnant no matter what. Now, Republicans have basically adopted two approaches to the healthcare crisis they caused. One, double down with increasingly extreme, dangerous proposals. Or two, stick their heads in the sand. Whether that means pretending this isn't a problem, pretending it's not really their fault, hoping it will fade away. But Madam President, there is just no forgetting the unforgivable pain Republicans' policies have caused. There is no forgetting the fear of being pregnant when you don't want to be, or the heartbreak of learning a pregnancy is not viable, or the horror of learning it is life-threatening and knowing you have no control over your body. There is no forgetting the panic of calculating how many thousands of miles you will have to travel to get care, or how many days you will have to take off of work, and wondering how you can possibly get the care you need and whether you will face legal action for doing so. There is no forgetting being investigated for having a miscarriage, or driving your kid across state lines to get an abortion, or hearing your doctor tell you they cannot act to save your life because they are afraid of going to jail. And people across this country are facing those realities every single day. Women are heartbroken and terrified. But Madam President, they are also mad. They are determined and they're speaking out. They are not going to settle for a country where they don't have the fundamental freedom to decide what happens to their own bodies, where their daughters and granddaughters have fewer rights than they did just a few years ago. And neither am I. We, on the Democratic side, are going to stand up, tell our stories, and we're going to make your voices heard. And we're going to fight here on this side to restore the freedoms that Republicans took away. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Whip.
Madam President, let me first salute my colleague from the state of Washington. She has really shown extraordinary leadership on this and so many other issues. She asked us to gather today, the first anniversary of the Dobbs decision, to really reflect on what's happened to America in 12 months. I would say, Madam President, that 2 months ago, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chair, held a hearing on the devastating consequences of the Dobbs decision on the women and doctors who are affected by them. We did it 2 months ago because the news was pouring in of incidents which had to be told and shared with the American people. Growing reports of chaos and harm caused by that decision were so alarming that we decided to move up our fact-finding to 2 months ago. There was one witness I'll never forget. One of the people we heard from that day was Amanda Zarowski. She shared some of the most heartbreaking testimony I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot. Last August, in the second trimester of her pregnancy, Amanda suffered a catastrophic medical condition which ensured that she would lose her much-loved and much-longed-for baby. What's more, without medical care to help manage her miscarriage, Amanda was in grave risk of dying herself. But she was denied that medical care for one reason. She lived in the wrong place. Because Amanda Zarowski lives in Texas, one of the first states to impose a near-total ban on abortions after Roe versus Wade was overruled. So Amanda waited at home in agony for days. Then sepsis set in. Her husband rushed her to the hospital. Hours later, her daughter arrived, stillborn. Amanda spent the next 3 days in the ICU fighting for her own life. Amanda told her committee, and I want to quote her words exactly, "People have asked why we didn't get on a plane or in our car and go to a state where the laws weren't so restrictive. But we live in the middle of Texas, and the nearest sanctuary state is at least an 8-hour drive. Developing sepsis, which can kill very quickly, in a car in the middle of West Texas desert or 30,000 feet above the ground is a death sentence. So all we could do was wait." This was Amanda's first baby. Tragically, because of the trauma her body endured, she may never have another. And she's not alone. This is happening to women across America. Every day brings us another heartbreaking story of a woman denied health care, another story of a woman whose life was needlessly put at risk by the Dobbs decision. According to a new survey, nearly 2/3 of OBGYNs say the Dobbs ruling has worsened maternal mortality rates in the United States, which were already the worst of any developed nation. And 70% of these doctors say the ruling has deepened racial disparities in maternal and infant health care. These findings are from a survey released this week by KFF, known as Kaiser Family Foundation. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the AMA both warned that the Dobbs case would unleash an immediate health care crisis in our country. With the first anniversary of this ruling, those warnings sadly have come true. Just 100 days after the Dobbs decision, 22 million Americans of reproductive age, almost 1 out of every 3 women in America, found themselves living in states where abortion is now illegal or highly restricted. Abortion is now completely banned in 14 states, leaving large swaths of the country without care. Some statewide bans include jail time for healthcare providers who perform abortions. And make no mistake, unless we act, more and more severe restrictions are coming. The last year has exposed the true aim of the anti-choice extremists. They want a national ban. Medication abortions account for more than half of all abortions in America. More than 20 years ago, the Food and Drug Administration approved the drug mifepristone as safe and effective for use in medication abortions. Yet anti-abortion groups are now seeking in federal court to ban its use in every state in America. The impact of abortion restrictions in any state are felt well beyond that state's borders. In my state, largely as a consequence of near-total bans in many surrounding states, the number of abortions performed by Planned Parenthood in Illinois increased by 54% last year. That increase was driven largely by women from out of state seeking access to abortion that is now outlawed in their home states. As a result, wait times to obtain abortions have increased dramatically in our state. In addition, some anti-choice extremists are seeking to deny women's right to abortions through increased threats and violence against abortion clinics. We saw this recently in Illinois, when a man rammed his car into a building that was being renovated to serve as an abortion clinic in the Danville area. He also tried to set fire to the clinic, but thankfully he was stopped. According to the National Abortion Federation, last year saw a huge increase in violence at abortion clinics, and a disproportionate increase occurred in states like Illinois that protect the women's rights to reproductive care. Personal decisions about health care should be made by individuals and their doctors, not by politicians with an ideological agenda. That is why I strongly support the 4 measures that my Democratic colleagues have offered today to protect women's rights to travel to receive health care, protect patients' data privacy, protect health care providers' ability to provide abortions in states where it's legal, and protect the right to contraception. It's hard to imagine in 2023 that we are actually facing the prospect of losing a woman's right to contraception, as well as access to reproductive health care. The Dobbs ruling has sown chaos, fear, and division. It has usurped doctors' rights to make the best health care decisions for their patients. Doctors live in fear of these new laws and whether they include criminal liability for what was good medical practice and still is. They've stripped women of their right to make health care decisions. and given the power to politicians. It is now up to Congress to protect women in health and providers from results of this disastrous ruling. Mr. President, you were at the Judiciary Committee today. We had a hearing on LGBTQ rights, and there was some extraordinary testimony. A 16-year-old came to us who has gone through a change to her status. This young woman at 16 years of age explained how she realized at the age of 10 or 11 that she was really inclined toward being a woman and not a man. She sought counseling through understanding parents, sat down with doctors, and they began working through the psychology of that decision, the importance of it. Fortunately for her, and she testified, her parents were supportive of her all the way. We were lucky to have Dr. Helena Lopez at the hearing as well. She practices medicine in Texas, and she's an endocrinologist who treats patients just like this young 16-year-old girl. She disabused us of many of the myths which are outstanding when it comes to health care for those who are in a trans situation. No, there are no surgeries early in life on these children who are making this decision. Yes, medications are held back until puberty to make sure that they're doing the right thing at the right time. Yes, parents are consulted every step of the way. These are important and critical decisions which parents and families make every day across America, every day. They're decisions based on the advice of a doctor as what is right for your child. They're decisions that parents will never forget. I know, I've been involved in them. And they're decisions which really will determine the future lives and the well-being of so many individuals. To think that so many legislatures across the United States are now regulating and putting criminal penalties on the conduct of that doctor who was before us today is heartbreaking. It defies medicine, it defies science. It's politics pure and simple. The same thing is true on this issue of women's reproductive health care. We've got to leave these basic decisions, fundamental decisions, to the families that are affected by them directly, to the women who are affected by them directly. And we've got to say to the doctors across America, follow the science, practice good medicine. Don't let a local legislature divert you from the best treatment of your patient to make sure that they come out of this process in a very positive way. It's a sad moment in America that we're debating these things and debating whether or not to rely on sound medical judgment. In the end, that's the only thing we can count on. And I'm glad that we had the hearing today, and I'm glad that we gathered on the floor to make a record out of what's happening in our great nation. I yield the floor.
Iowa, right? I love that. And then, Senator from Illinois.
Following nominations. All nominations placed on the Secretary's desk in the Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, and Space Force. That the nominations be confirmed en bloc. Excuse me, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions would be in order to any of the nominations, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Was that what I think?